Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer Jones. Great to be together with you again as we finish Mark 16, kind of. I guess it depends on where you think the ending of Mark is, and we will talk about that today. But we're going to do verses 5, 6, 7, and 8, the account of the resurrection. We've spent a lot of time leading up to this. I just want to note that when we first started this series some years ago now, um, I didn't know we were doing all of Mark, and so I was doing selections before, but we have done almost all of Mark now, with the exception of part of chapter 3, actually most of chapter 3. So after today, we'll take 2 more sessions to get through chapter 3. We'll probably go a little bit quicker through that material, or maybe less detailed, but I'll leave lots of time for questions on both of those. So that's coming up the next couple of weeks. Keep an eye on your email for that. And of course, you can reach out to me if you want to, abramkj@accordancebible.com to chat more about that. But today, Mark 16, 5 through 8, the resurrection of Jesus. This is part 2 of Mark 16, 1 through 8. Of course, we looked at the first 4 verses last time. Just a few logistics to make sure we're all set up. This handout that you see on your screen is available to you at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. That's got all the handouts from this whole series going back to when we started. So you can find that there. It's there now. You can also, if you're here live now, you can access that in the materials section of the GoToWebinar control panel. If you're not seeing that, just click the 3 horizontal dots to show more. But what you're looking for is an icon that's a piece of notebook paper and a paper clip. So click that. It will show you materials, and then you'll see the PDF there. We'll also send it to those of you who are registered, who are here live now, or if you registered and didn't make it live, that will be coming to you in an email, the handout will, as well as a recording, because we are recording today. But like I said, everything is also at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. That is a shortcut link to a shared Google Drive folder where I've got this handout and others. There's a questions box that you can use to communicate with me. It's just called questions. It's got a little quote bubble with the question mark in it. That's a one-way typed chat. I will either respond to your question privately or anonymize it and share it with the group and answer it out loud that way. I think that covers our logistics, so let's dive in. We're going to start with some review of last time, Mark 16, 1 through 4. Just so that we make sure we're all on the same page for what we see today. This is my translation from last time. Now, when the Sabbath had passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. This is Jesus, of course, and maybe because it's the beginning of a chapter, we want to spell out the referent to him there. And very early on the first day of the week, at sunrise, they went to the tomb. They had been asking each other, "Who will roll away for us the stone from the entrance of the tomb?" But looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, even though it was very large. And we talked about that ending at last time, that it ends, and I'll just pull this up. It ends with this, at least initially, perplexing gar here, this for it was very large. And we talked about some different possible ways that that could be translated and how that connects to the rest of the sentence. But one way or the other, they are faced with a challenge. It's been surmounted. It's improbable. And I think that's the basic gist of what Mark is communicating here, is that this stone had been rolled away, even though that is quite an obstacle, a literal physical obstacle to move out of the way. So that paves the way for what is now in verse 5. Now they're going to go into the tomb. So let me go to Accordance and pull that up there. Kai eselthusai eis ta mnemean, edon neaniskan, kathemenon en tois dexiois, peribeblemenon stalein lucain, kai ezetham bethesan. If we go left to right, just kind of a wooden translation to start, and going into, so we have ace, with erkomai, eis erkomai, so going into, that's a participle, so I'm just doing ing for now, and going into the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in, I'm sorry, sitting rather, they saw a young man sitting at the right or on the right side. They saw takes this accusative noun here. They saw a young man, but they didn't just see the young man. They saw the young man with an accompanying action, although maybe action's a strange word for sitting, a verb anyway. So we've got a participle on here. That's an accusative participle because it matches the young man that they saw. So they saw a young man sitting at the right side. Maybe not surprised to see this in the plural, tois dexiois. We don't talk about the right side in the plural in English. We could even search and see other times that's used, but they saw him peribeblemenon. Again, there's that on. So here's another action or verb, I should say. He's dressed, stolen leukein, in a white robe. And now this is back to the women, this verb describing them, exetham bethesan. And we've got that thes, or the the augment there, which gives us that it's in the passive. And then we've got san, which is the ending for third person plural. So they were alarmed, astounded, shocked. We'll come back to that. Here's what I've got from my translation in the handout. Then, going into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, or sitting on the right, dressed in a white robe, and they were astounded. This is more necessary when you read something like Paul's epistles, but even for Mark, who tends to have simpler sentence structure, even for Mark, I find it helpful to establish what the finite verb is and the participle and how they're related to each other. And especially because here we have a participle that's describing the women, and then we have a finite verb for the women. We have a participle describing the young man, another one here, and then another finite verb for the women. So we've got both finite verbs and participles, but we've also got two particular subjects here that could be the subjects of any of these verbs. So I find it helpful to just get clear first on what are the finite verbs or the main verbs and the participle. Now, we can do that by looking at the endings and saying, all right, this is this thusai here, it's a feminine participle. We could look at edan and see that as a finite verb. We could also use the instant details. So esel thusai, aorist active participle, feminine plural nominative, edan, aorist active indicative third plural, and then we get this other aorist passive indicative third plural here. Another way, and we've often looked at these diagram tools, you can see in the diagrams how the verbs go together, and so you'll find the finite verbs will have their own horizontal line. Remember, the subject is at left of this vertical line, and then the predicate, everything that's said about the subject, is at the right. So we've got edan and exetham bethesan, so two finite verbs, and then esel thusai as a participle is subordinate to saw. So Mark isn't just saying they saw and were astounded. He's saying, and going in, they saw and were astounded. And this is a pretty, I don't know if generic's the right word, but it's a pretty safe translation. But with participles, they can carry other meaning than just ing. So you'll see some translations that will say something like, and as they entered the tomb, this is just in entering the tomb, or when they entered. We have going into the tomb, upon entering, after they entered. You could render it more specifically, but that participle gives us a little bit more description. So they're walking into the tomb, and what do they see? They see this young man, and they were astounded. I just wanted to note, we kind of unpacked the on endings here, and this is mercifully consistent here, on, and so we know that we've got a young man sitting, these are all accusative case, dressed in a white robe. I just wanted to note for a moment the word order here. If you follow the Greek word order, which of course we don't always have to do, and sometimes we simply can't because it will make for unintelligible English, but if we follow the word order, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe. And I preserved it that way because I like to whenever possible, and I want us to see how the English matches to the Greek. You would want to decide for your own translation, does this feel a little bulky or cumbersome? I've got a number of commas here to kind of set things apart. Does that slow down the reading for the reader, whether that reader is you when you read your own translation or somebody else? A more natural English word order would give us something like, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. So that dressed in a white robe, we would think of more as like an adjective that describes the subject, and then we get the action of sitting on the right side. So that's just a decision you can make. I think you're not compromising fidelity to the text at all by doing that. Some translations do that, others don't. I think this works fine, what we've got here, but you may find that's a little comma heavy. Well, the big question here is, how do we translate these Greek words? That's always the question. And what does this word mean and how is it functioning here? I think maybe the bigger question for this verse is, who is this young man? Now, the answer in translation is, he is a young man. So if the question, in other words, is, they saw neaniskon, what does that word mean? It means a young man. And we can triple click that word to find it in our default Greek lexicon: a relatively young man, a youth, a young man. This doesn't say anything about his age. Young is as ambiguous potentially in English as it is in Greek, so I think that's just a great translation. One person's young is another person's old, but he's a young man. All right, so that part's easy enough, I think. But who is he and what is he doing there? That's maybe a little harder question. And again, I would not bring this out in translation because Mark doesn't, but for meaning, it's important to know. And this is just a very short summary. This is from the SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics Exegetical Summary series that we've got in accordance. It gives a kind of catalog summarizing of commentaries and translations. And it's actually fairly straightforward here. It just notes, citing a couple sources, that Mark does not identify the young man as an angel, but the long white robe suggests it. And Matthew 28:2 confirms it. So if the question is, who is this person? And if we go to Matthew, we can open it via the cross reference. And we've got, let's see, suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel, angelos of the Lord, descending from heaven, came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. Now, this is maybe a little bit different than he's at the right inside the tomb. Potentially, it's at least described differently, but his clothing white as snow. Do not be afraid, he is not here. So really, this, even if some of these details look different at first, this is the same person because we've got the same quote. So, or same person, same entity, I think. I think that's a pretty safe interpretation. It is an interpretation, but I think it's a safe one. So on that basis, this quote is saying Matthew is confirming that this is an angel, which the long white robe, which Mark does say, is already giving us. Now, again, it would be over translating to conclude that white robe gives you angel, and also to import Matthew as evidence for your translation of Mark. Again, for the meaning, I see that as highly justified. I think there's a really good case for that. It's hard to see otherwise from my vantage point. But for translation, we want to take Mark on Mark's terms. So in our translation of Mark, this is a young man, not an angel. I think I didn't check other versions, but we would be hard pressed to find angel in any translation. We've got young man, young man, young man. Again, because all these translations, even with their different philosophies, are wanting to be true to what Mark is saying. And so even if we think Mark has an angel in mind, it's young man. So again, easy translation decision in my opinion, but still there's a question of meaning that we would want to unpack here. And in fact, here's a source that says the translation should follow the text and call him a young man, even though the circumstances would imply that he was really an angel. So he is, his presence there is enough to alarm them. I mean, there are a few things that are surprising here. Mark doesn't describe them all. He does describe the tomb being opened with the stone being rolled away. That's shocking enough. This guy's presence here is shocking. Also, Mark doesn't say it explicitly, but in verse 6, this young man will say Jesus is not here. Presumably, they already know that, or they're starting to get a sense of it. So it's not just like, what are you doing here? It's what are you doing here, and what is Jesus not doing here? You know, as long as they can see that Jesus is not there. So it's no surprise that this is Mark's word, exethambethesan. They were shocked. I would spend some time on this word. I'm going to just do a short time with you on this. If you have comments or questions on it, I'd love to hear it. But I'll triple click this. BDAG gives us for ekthambeo to be moved to a relatively intense emotional state because of something causing great surprise or perplexity. That is what you call a definition. And then what's after that in italics is a gloss or a translation equivalent. Be very excited. I've said before, we know from BDAG that this is a wonderful definition. It would not be something we'd put into our translation. We would not say, and the women were moved to a relatively intense emotional state, causing great surprise or perplexity. So we would want to think about, all right, well, what words do we have here for this? We have excited. We also have, and in fact, even 16:5 is put here, amazed, be overwhelmed, be alarmed, be distressed. I think probably the main decision to make here, I mean, if you want one English word for this, and there are multiple ones, so that's a decision. But I think even before that, a question we could ask is, is this like a positive surprise or amazement, for lack of a better word, or is it negative, or is it something in between? Is it all of the above? We could even look at how this word is used in Mark and compare and see what range of meaning is available. In English, a lot of these words, you can be surprised and not in a good way, or you can be surprised and it's a wonderful surprise or shock or whatever it is. So I think the first thing is to try to discern what's their reaction, what's the quality of that shock or that being overwhelmed. And that may take some time. I think that's potentially hard to do with certainty. You would need to read the rest of the passage. You would need to see, as we will, as we go on, that the young man says, don't be this same word, astounded, shocked, overwhelmed. And then we could look at them again in verse 8, and we do see that they go out and flee. They're trembling and they're shocked. And they said nothing to no one, for they were afraid. So this, I would generally describe these as, again, for lack of a better word, as negative emotions. I mean, these are not like pleasant emotions. And so I think you could take that and bring that into this verse and use a word that's shocked, that maybe has a little bit more of a negative connotation. Overwhelmed, you could use that too. Overwhelmed tends to have a more negative connotation. But I think that's just worth further study in the passage. Try to figure out, okay, based on the context, how are these women reacting? And we want to look ahead for that. For me, I think astounded is a good word because it leaves room for all of the above. I mean, they don't want Jesus to be dead. So if Jesus is not dead, that's a really good thing for them. But I'm not sure they've quite put everything together yet to the point where they could be positive about it. But again, Mark just doesn't give us this like deep dive into their inner state. So all that's to say, I think this is a hard word to translate. I could see a case for translating it more on the negative side of shock or amazement. But I'm not sure enough of that. I think a word like astounded is great because it is as multivalent as this Greek word. It doesn't necessarily imply to me anyway, that this is a positive or a negative amazement. This would also be good to look at in your commentaries, and you're most likely to find comment on this in your Greek heavy commentaries. So France, for example, in his New International Greek Testament commentary, he will talk about how this same word in 1433, he says, conveys a powerful mixture of shock and fear. And then he does note 16:8, and that reaction more consonant with meeting with an angel than with an ordinary young man. So he's kind of leaning toward the, this is almost an unpleasant shock. But again, that's a lot to do with one word as you're translating. So my personal approach, and you may have a different approach, but my personal approach is if there's some degree of ambiguity in the Greek as I read it, is there an English word that can accurately not only translate that word, but also preserve some of the ambiguity there? So if you agree, then astounded would be great. If you don't agree, if you think this is pretty clearly a negative emotion, you might be more inclined to do something like overwhelmed or shocked. But I will pause there and see if you've got questions or comments. I know we're actually, believe it or not, this is kind of a quicker study of this word than I think is warranted. So I think this probably deserves further discussion or study. But I'll just pause there because I do want to make sure we get through verse 8 today. But I especially want to hear from you. If you've got comments or questions, you can type them into the question box and I will read them, either respond individually or share with the group. Otherwise, we can just take a moment to pause and let that verse sink in, and we'll continue on with the narrative in verse 6. All right, we get verse 6 now. I'm going to go to accordance for this. Ha de lege autais, me ekthambeste, Yesun zetete tan Nazarenan, tan estauromenan, egerthe, uk estin hode, ide hatapas hapu ethekan autan. De for, I think, but is the best translation. But he, ha, says to them, present active indicative, do not fear, or do not be astounded, or whatever you did in the last verse, but it's the same verb, ekthambeo. So they are ekthambeo-ing, and he says, don't ekthambeo. Jesus, whom you are seeking, the Nazarene, the one who was crucified. Notice we've got this new ending here for Jesus in the accusative. We've got tan for accusative, on, tan again, and on. So all of this is about Jesus. Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified, you were looking for. He has raised, or he has been risen, or he has risen, like a punctiliar event. Like this is a snapshot of the action with the aorist here. Uk estin hode, he is not here. Ide, behold, or look, or check it out. Hatapas, the place, hapu, where, thekan autan, the place where they laid him. I'm just going to open up the diagrams to show that this last clause is a verbless one. And there could be any number of reasons for that. It could just be stylistic. It could also be that Mark, in his fast-moving narrative, wants to kind of keep that feel. Maybe there's a breathlessness. Well, there is a breathlessness to this whole thing, and maybe that comes out with a verbless clause. That may be overreading it, but at any rate, we've got hatapas, hapu ethekan autan. So the place where they laid him, but implied here is this is the place where they laid him, or here is the place where they laid him. But what he's trying to say, he's not trying to say this is where Jesus is buried. Come over here. It's right here at this spot. He's saying, look, the place where he was buried it's empty. There's no one. There's nobody here now. So I think again, that's maybe more meaning than needs to be brought out in translation. I think the primary decision here is, do you keep it a verbless clause if you think that works in English, or do you supply the verb. I think a verbless clause works just fine because of the ide, look. So I'm suggesting, look, the place where they laid him. Now, again, that's not a complete sentence in English, and Greek, like Hebrew, is more permissive of verbless clauses than I think English is. But I think if you can possibly preserve that, that's great, because there's this almost like choppy staccato, like he has risen, he is not here. Look, the place where they laid him. I mean, there's just this, remember, there's this astonishment. So there's this fast moving narrative. And in fact, I mean, when you think about it, this number of verses is just, in my opinion, a very small number of verses for such a powerful event, which may describe why we have some other endings to Mark. But he says, do not be astounded. Again, that's from Ekthon Be'o. So however you've translated it in verse 5, in this case, I would translate it exactly the same way, because it is a direct response to whatever it is that you translate in verse 5. And it's negated. It's saying, don't do that, or don't be that. So consistency here would be important. So they were astounded, don't be astounded. Or they were overwhelmed, don't be overwhelmed. They were shocked, don't be shocked. And this young man knows what they're looking for, or whom they're looking for. Again, chalk up another point of evidence for the fact that this is an angel, or a being with more knowledge than just a typical human would have. And we get this agerthe. Now, arguably, this is the most important word in the whole passage, just in terms of this narrative here. I have not even put a note on it there. I don't mean to suggest it's not important. It's just amazing, though, that Mark just gives us this one word for this powerful event. I mean, this is the resurrection right here. I mean, the he is not here, and look, the place where they laid him. That's all supporting evidence for that. But already he's gone ahead to the whatever's next. So this agerthe, I mean, talk about a short and concise account of the resurrection. I mean, there's all this stuff that leads up to it, as we know, but it's it's the one word. So this could be worth looking at again in a word study. I don't think there's much debate on what this means. Here, BDAG gives us to enter into or be in a state of life as a result of being raised. If you thought it would bring out the meaning better, you could say he has been raised from the dead, although I think that's probably already implied, because they're in the tomb, and then the guy says, look, the place where he laid. But do consider this word, and I would even suggest searching it in Mark and looking at all the other times that Mark uses it. They may not all be about the resurrection, but some of them will, and so that would be a fruitful study. You might even just add a parallel pane if you want to look quickly in English. And so you will see where Herod thought John the Baptist was raised. Sometimes we get this more mundane meaning, like just raise someone to their feet. That's not a life or death thing. The dead being raised. And then this hugely important verse will come up with this search, Mark 14:28. We'll come back to this in a minute, but here Jesus is saying, "Ala metata egerthenai me," after my raising, or after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. After I am resurrected, you might even say. So the young man is not done talking. I just want to pause and check and see if we've got questions. I don't see any, so we'll keep going, but we'll stop again after verse 7. So the speech continues in verse 7. I'll go back to accordance for this. Al hupagete epate tois mate tais autu, kaito petro hati proage humas estain Galilean, eke auton absiste, kathos epen humin. But go, say to, or tell his disciples and Peter. Notice the dative there. So we've got to his disciples and to Peter. So you could say to his disciples and to Peter, that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, or into Galilee. There him you will see, just as he said to you. Here's how I've translated it. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said to you. Uh, Again, with epate tois mate tais, that dative gives us this to, but say to his disciples and to Peter. You could translate it that way, but usually in English, instead of say to somebody, we would tend to say tell. There is this kind of funny question of the disciples and Peter, like, well, isn't Peter a disciple? Why is he drawn out? Why is he mentioned separately from here? Interestingly, on that point, the New English translation, the Net Bible, renders this kai not as and, but as even, which kai can mean. I mean, that's not unusual. It's a marker of connections, most generally speaking, but somewhere down here we'll find even for a meaning. It's going to be in there somewhere. So kai can mean even. And so I thought that was interesting that if you understand it that way, tell his disciples, even Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. Even if you don't do it that way, tell his disciples and Peter, it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, because you would expect, or I would expect, tell his disciples that he is going ahead of you. It already includes Peter. Why are we mentioning him? Well, here's from the SIL Exegetical Summary Series. No shortage of interpretation about this in the 2,000 years that have followed. No shortage of sermons, and no shortage of opinions. So here are just some, and I'll read from this. I put this quote in your handout. But it says, this does not mean Peter was no longer a disciple because of his denial, but that he needed the restoring effect of this announcement more than the other disciples because his faith had been shaken the most. Now, I'm not sure we have Mark actually saying Peter's faith has been shaken the most, but we do have some pretty intense narratives of Peter, and Peter betraying Jesus and then figuring out what he's done and weeping. So yeah, I mean, he's definitely been shaken. So I think that's plausible. Another possibility, it means, and in particular, Peter. So with that meaning, it's not like Peter, in spite of all he's done, that there's almost a, maybe not a privileging, but there's a focusing on Peter that maybe isn't because of anything bad he's done. Maybe it's just for whatever reason, Peter gets singled out here. That's a possibility. And in fact, I mean, that could have to do with Peter's connection to Mark, which I am not sure I've seen listed anywhere, but another possibility, God graciously provided for Peter's special needs through the words of the angel. Peter is singled out because he had denied Jesus. This is a message of assurance that Peter was still included in the circle of the disciples in spite of his denials. So once again, as is so often the case, we have something that's fairly easy to translate from Greek into English. Tois mate tais autou kai to Petro. That means to his disciples and to Peter, or the kai could mean even. Other than that, fairly straightforward. Interpretation is maybe a little bit more challenging, and we might just take some time. This would be a great time, I think, to go back. We won't do it now, but just to revisit Peter and what has led up to this for him. It is true that at this point in the story, as we head to the final verse of the shorter ending of Mark, as it's called, it is true that right now, both Peter and the women are not like being painted in the most positive light necessarily. I don't know that this astounded here is disparaging, but there's a lot here so far that really just kind of makes you wonder how are people going to respond? I mean, everyone's kind of scattered, and Peter gets singled out here, and the women are, maybe they're kind of frozen in fear at this point. We're not really sure, but so it does set up some intrigue, I think. We'll get to that in just a minute, but anytime you see somebody say, just as he said to you, you're probably wondering, as I did, where did he say to you? So we've got eke auton opseste, there you will see him, just as kathos epen humin, or even the just as could be exactly as he said to you. So what is it that he said to you? Well, that you will see him and that he's going ahead of you into Galilee. we know from just searching this a moment ago that we've got verse 14:28. I will go ahead of you into Galilee after I have been raised. So that's pretty explicitly what has just been described with a lot of the same words. So again, the question being, where has Jesus said that? Well, it's in Mark 14:28. Mark has quoted Jesus as saying, but after I am raised, I will go before you into Galilee. Now, that would be a passage, and we won't do it now, but we've gone through that whole passage. It would be interesting to read the whole thing here and see what else is going on. In fact, this is at the Last Supper, and Jesus is talking about you will all fall away. So it's not just that he's going ahead of them, but he's going ahead of them. And where are they? And you've got Peter here. In fact, Peter said, even if they fall away, I will not. Maybe that's why Peter gets mentioned here, because he was mentioned here separately. And Mark is kind of bringing Peter over with this part of the text that he's bringing over into verse 16. And when I say Mark is bringing over, I mean, one way to view this is Mark is just quoting people. He's just describing people. So it may not be deliberate so much as he's just trying to explain what happened. But this is where Jesus had said it to them. After I am raised, I will go before you into Galilee. Now, to me, that sets up a whole potential future narrative of, okay, I'm getting ready as a reader to follow them. According to the shorter ending of Mark, it's not going to go very far. In fact, it's just going to stop. It's going to stop right here. And we'll spend some time on that. I'm leaving a little extra time for us to talk about Mark's ending. But let me hear from you if you've got questions or comments. I'd love to hear them. I'll put them in the chat anonymously and respond. Somebody said, especially Peter. So as a possibility for Kai there, especially Peter, given he had denied him. Peter wasn't with John at the cross. Was Peter with those at a distance? Maybe, not sure if we are told. Yeah. So what we're sure about is that Mark and this young man, that it is seen fit to mention Peter separately. So I think we have to do something with it. I mean, it's not for nothing. It's not what you would expect with just saying the disciples. So yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities there, and that's a good one too. What other comments or questions do folks have before we move to verse 8? Right. Yeah, here's a good comment. Somebody said, this could be to single out Mark as secretary to Peter. He's telling Peter's account. Peter was telling his point of view. Right. Yep, exactly. That connection could have something to do with that. Let's move on to verse 8. Feel free to keep comments and questions coming. Verse 8 of chapter 16. Kai eselthusai ephugon apo tu mnemeu, echen gar autas tramas kai ekstasis, kai udeni uden epan, ephambunta gar. Now you'll notice there's more text here. We'll come back to that in just a moment. This is as much as we're going to do with the Greek. So let me do that much left to right, and then we'll talk about some of the issues that come up. And going out of the tomb, and going out, they fled from the tomb. For something had them. We've got autas here, the accusative. We have to wait till we get to traumas. There's our nominative. And there's a kai with ekstasis. There's another nominative. So we've got a compound subject here, the verb of which is echen, and autas is the object. So traumas and ekstasis had them, or gripped them, or seized them. We've got kind of a funny word order here with the verb, and then the object, and then the subject. And to no one, nothing, they said. Remember, the Greek double negative is for emphasis, whereas in English, we would understand a double negative as canceling out and really meaning a positive. We would not typically translate this. They didn't say anything to no one, but it's emphatic here. They said absolutely nothing to nobody. Why? epha bunta gar, for they were afraid. Let's spend a little bit more time with this verse, and then we'll look at the endings together. Here's how I translated it. Then they, this is the women, then they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and shock had seized them. And they said nothing to no one, for they were afraid. And they said nothing to anyone. Can you say they said nothing to no one? I think that might not be the best English. And they said nothing to anyone, I think is probably what we want there. See, I was so caught up in the Greek there that I didn't even make that change. Anyway, the idea is they're not saying nothing to nobody, for they were afraid. There's a nice little inclusio here, I noticed, that kind of bookends 5 and 8, ezelthusai to mnemeu, and 16:5 had aselthusai, ace ta mnemeon. So we had this feminine participle from erkomai with ace here, so into, and erkomai with x here, out of. And in both cases, it's the tomb. So they go into the tomb, they go out of the tomb. Those are just nice rhetorical bookends that Mark gives us. It also moves the scene along. And they not only went out, but they fled. I mean, they went out in a hurry. They ran away. They got out of there as quickly as they could. Why? Gar, for trembling and shock had seized them. So it is not that they are leaving because Jesus has gone ahead of them and they want to follow him, at least as Mark describes it here. The reason that Mark says they leave the tomb is here, gar, this grounding clause. Why? Because trembling and shock had seized them. You could say they were trembling and shocked. The compound subject, as I noted, is in the nominative case. It's traumas kai ekstasis. I've just tried to preserve that here. If this feels like awkward English to you, I think you'd be perfectly justified in saying they were shocked and terrified, or however you translate that. Some translations make that move, in fact. Of course, in the Authorized Standard Version of the King James, they're going to keep it a little closer to Greek. For trembling and astonishment had come upon them. But you've got here, like the Common English Bible, overcome with terror and dread. Here it's just adjectives, trembling and bewildered. So you'll see different options here for that. It's worth looking at each of these words more fully. Traumas, kai, ekstasis. I haven't put a whole lot here by way of notes, except maybe just a placeholder note that these are worth studying. And they're really words that go together. But they are two separate words. It's possible that two words could have this kind of combined intensifying effect. And maybe you have one really good word that captures both of them. I'm just translating each word as best I can here. But the general feel, and we'll talk in a minute more about these words, but the general feel is that their senses are flooded now. They are just completely overwhelmed. They are beside themselves. BDAG gives us that as an option for one of the words here. They're just beside themselves. This, I think, going back to the question of the nature of their amazement previously in the passage, this, I think, would be evidence for the fact that it was like more of a shock kind of amazement than a like, oh my goodness, this is so wonderful, we're so happy, and I can't believe this happened, and I'm so glad it did. That's not really the sense that Mark seems to be conveying here. But each of these words, a word study, we'll just look at BDAG for now, although it's always good to compare lexicons. But for traumas, we get trembling, quivering. For ekstasis, this is the same word that also brings us ecstasy, so which is kind of like a trance-like meaning, but BDAG is noting this here when it's with traumas, that it kind of qualifies the meaning, constrains it a little bit more. So BDAG gives this as a state of consternation or profound emotional experience to the point of being beside oneself. So again, there are a number of ways you could render this, maybe some creatively, but it is just, I mean, it's almost like words fall short to really describe how they are. But all Mark has here are words, and that's what we have as translators. So we need some words, but these are words that are, I think, trying to say there's like an overwhelming of the system here. this is probably a verse you'll find more variation here, like trembling in astonishment, trembling and bewildered, terror and dread. So that's even more explicit in the more like negative quality here of their feeling. Trembling and astonishment. Get that a few times here. Trembling and amazed. I noted some of these translations preserve the word order, so trembling and astonishment had seized them. There's almost like this, if not a personifying note here, there's this like power that the trembling and astonishment have, that those emotions and feelings and reactions have overcome the women. They've technically they've had them, they have them. These feelings overcome them. Um, let's see what else. We've got trembling and astonishment, trembling and amazed. Yeah, terror and dread is maybe a little bit of an outlier here. But they said nothing to anyone, so correcting apparently my bad English in my translation. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. I just want to note here as we transition into talking about, is this really the best ending of Mark as we can discern it? I just want to note that they are not doing what the young man tells them to do in verse 7, and emphatically so. I mean, whatever else is happening here, Mark wants to make it pretty clear that they are told by the young men or by the young man to do this thing, and that they don't do that thing. They run away, and they are told to tell something to somebody, specifically the disciples and Peter, but they say nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Effabunta gar. Now, if this were the ending of Mark, which it may well be, in my opinion, what an ending this would be. Now, again, the translating is easy enough with this word, but part of translation is figuring out what's part of the earliest attainable text as best as we can figure it. And we've done some text criticism in these sessions together. I would suggest, and I'll share my write-up just briefly with you in a moment, but I would go to something like a text commentary here, like Metzger. You will have in the NA28 with Sigla, if you've got that text, you will find some notes where you've got extended details about what's going on here with the ending. Now, as we know, those are a little bit, those can be tricky apparatuses to decipher. So I like Metzger because he just puts that all in prose. But this is long, and this will be in probably literally any commentary you have on the book of Mark, whether it's Greek oriented or not. So there is no shortage of material here to look at. So I'm not being thorough with it, but you'll just see here, Metzger is a great place to start. 4 endings of the gospel, according to Mark, are current in the manuscripts. What that means is that it's not an issue of translation per se. It's not even an issue of whether, yeah, like the issue is that we have different manuscripts saying different things, and that may happen from time to time. We'll see different spellings, or maybe a clause is left out or reordered or something. This is a pretty significant divergence according to manuscripts. So it's saying here the last 12 verses of the commonly received text, so ending at verse 8, are absent from the 2 oldest manuscripts and some others. And then it even talks about early interpretation. Several witnesses continue after verse 8 with a little bit of an ending, and then even more of an ending. The traditional ending of Mark, so familiar through the authorized version and other translations, is present in the vast number of witnesses. We've got some witnesses to that too. And more here. So this is a great, I mean, this is a lot more. Metzger usually doesn't go into this level of detail for a textual variant, but this is much more than a textual variant. So he's got the 4 options and then how to evaluate them. I was trained in text criticism to evaluate based on internal evidence and external evidence. And as I learned it, the external evidence is a little bit easier to point to. So for example, we can look at manuscripts to get evidence for like how many manuscripts, how many of the oldest and most reliable ones have this, and you can kind of figure it out that way. Internal evidence would be something like, you know, verses 9 through 20 use vocabulary that is not frequent in Mark. So that has nothing to do with the manuscripts per se. And so you might say this vocabulary in this so-called longer ending is pretty foreign to Mark, doesn't sound like him, therefore point against this being included. That's internal evidence. Now, there's debate as to how valuable that evidence might be, because who's to say Mark just didn't write in a different style for the last part. But I do think it's compelling when you get enough language and words and sentence structure that don't kind of seem to fit with the rest of the book, you at least wonder, okay, internally, I'm not sure this fits. So I will I'd love to hear from you on this. This is admittedly a huge topic, and I'm sorry to be cutting it so short, but I've given you just a short one-page write-up on where I'm at with this for what it's worth. Again, I think what you'll see here is more kind of thinking through internal evidence. I think the external evidence deserves a lot of attention too. I didn't really speak to that here. Again, I'd recommend Metzger or Comfort has a text commentary that we've looked at before, and he's going to have, see, again, notice that usually these are like short entries for variations, but he's going to have a longer one too. In fact, this is laid out really well. And at 16:8, they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid. So that's one ending. There's this shorter ending. So there's the short ending, and then there's this other short ending where what's in brackets that I didn't go over is added or included, and that Comfort gives us a translation here. All that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those with Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from the east and as far as the west, the holy and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. Now, this gets some pushback because to many people, I think maybe including myself, that does not sound like Mark at all. However, we've got some manuscript evidence for it. And what's appealing about this is that you have these women who are really faithful women. So the fact that they wouldn't tell about Jesus is, I mean, speaking of shock, like that's shocking to me as a reader. These are women who, even when the disciples had left, they were there with Jesus at the cross. Even when everyone had given up and run away, they were there bringing spices to the tomb. So to my mind, the fact that they would not kind of follow in this same trajectory, that is shocking, and apparently to others as well. So this here, you see here, okay, well, at first they didn't say anything because they were afraid, but then as they thought about it some more, they told to those with Peter. So that's another ending, and then you've got this traditional longer ending. This is the one that talks about handling snakes and speaking in new tongues. Again, you've got some manuscript evidence for this, and then another possible longer ending. So Comfort is great here. I mean, there's even more text here than Metzger's got, but even a one-volume commentary will cover this. I'm trying to make a case here for ending where we ended today with Mark. And I'm not trying to convince anybody. I mean, this, again, is just there's a lot of factors here. But if it ends at "for they were afraid," how could that be? And I'll just leave this with you for further reading. But my professor of Greek, one of my professors, Brian Abasciano, who's a pastor and also has published some scholarly work on Romans, he puts this well. If this is the ending, so let's say, for example, you just decide based on manuscripts. Let's say you're just going to do external evidence, and you conclude, you know, through text criticism and consulting Metzger and Comfort and all the others, maybe you conclude, yeah, it looks like the best manuscripts say that the ending really should be "they were afraid." If that's what you conclude, the question is why. Dr. Abasciano says to present the amazing and fearful fact of the resurrection and to challenge the reader to respond to the resurrection faithfully. Throughout the gospel, the disciples have failed repeatedly and exhibited hard hearts. Now we are left with the example of an unfaithful response to Jesus' resurrection. And not just one, not just the women. I mean, you have all the betrayal leading up to this, Judas, Peter, all the others, and now the women too. Even the women who were with him to the bitter end, even they. So Mark is asking, according to Abishano, how will you respond? Will you say nothing to anyone, or will you identify with Jesus and his resurrection? Now, again, I wouldn't conclude this just on theological grounds or internal grounds. I mean, you need to ask the question: is it plausible that Mark would do this wink and a nod to a broader readership? I mean, I think I've seen that before. John makes this question easy because John is explicit. He says, these are written that you may believe, you, the reader, the listener. I mean, John is as clear as you can be about a purpose. Mark is not giving us that. So that is an interpretation that I think requires some evidence, and it also needs to be held with how you evaluate the external evidence, the different manuscripts. But I do find this, if unsettling, I find it a fairly compelling read. Again, if the manuscript evidence can support this, which I think it does pretty well, then this would make it make sense to me, because otherwise, why on earth would you end with disobedience and they were afraid? And some people have asked that question and said you wouldn't. So that's not the ending. So I will leave this with you, and again, just commend any commentaries you can get your hands on there. You might even go to File, New Tab, Research, and maybe try a phrase like Mark ending, and just search all your tools. And it's going to be no shortage of resources here. You'll probably even find this like in the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. You'll find something there. But again, I would start with these text commentaries like Comfort and Metzger, and what's the other one? Omanson, which is I think like an abridgment or a simplification of Metzger. Any of those text guides. But yeah, here we go. I mean, this is here's France on the textual evidence. So again, we're doing like none of that right now. That would be my actual starting point. I mean, it has been as I've studied this over the years, and he's got a lot here. So anything that is in your library will come up here, and typically you'll have whole sections, whether it's in commentaries or you might have in the dictionaries. Let's see if Jesus in the Gospels dictionary has that. Yep, Mark's ending. There it is. So we've got a whole article on that. So we will stop there, whether we think that's the end of Mark or not. That's where we will end with Mark. And just to mention again that we've still got 2 more sessions, Mark chapter 3, most of which we previously did not cover. And that will take us through to the end of the book. Now, if you are undecided about the ending, or if you just want to do the translation, and if it's going to bother you that we're stopping at verse 8 and you want to go on, do be assured, as you can see in the instant details, Accordance has parsing and translation equivalents and inflections, morphology for all of these words. This is often not the case with textual variants, because sometimes we'll just see them in an apparatus and it will be unpointed Hebrew or unpointed Greek in this case, and it won't be morphologically tagged, which makes translating difficult. So like if there's a verse that some manuscripts have and don't, we've seen some of those, maybe there's nothing here, it's in the apparatus, but everything here is tagged. So if you wanted to go ahead and still translate this, and even just follow the brackets, you would be able to do that with all the same helps that you could. I don't know that, I mean, you could check your info pane too. I don't know that you're going to get quite the same level of detail on all these verses necessarily. But at least like in the UBS Translators handbooks, you've got that there. So that would certainly be a project that you could choose to take on. I know we're at time, so let me just briefly see if we have any questions I haven't answered. Yeah, let me take this comment and put this in the chat, and then we'll wrap up. let me try this again. I'll put this in one more place in the chat. Somebody saying, said nothing to anyone, could refer to the period of their leaving as they left the garden, and said nothing, but outside of the garden, they did tell someone, as we see in the parallel accounts. Yes, excellent. Yeah, and they, I mean, even if you just take Mark by himself, they had to tell somebody because Mark knows. So it's not like it ended there and nobody ever found out. Or yeah, so yes, I think that's a great interpretation, that maybe Mark ends there for effect, but Mark isn't meaning to say they never told anyone ever. Maybe there's even some irony there, but that's right on about the parallel accounts. That would be part of what to consider too when trying to figure out what the ending is here. Thanks for that comment. I'm going to end the recording, but stay on for just a moment. So if you are watching a recording, again, abramkj@accordancebible.com is my email address, and you can go to tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes for this outline and for all the others.